Hey there, my name is ARTFX, and today we're not doing any sound design. Today we are talking about templates. Let's get to it. So here we are in Ableton Live, and this is my template project. So I'm gonna show you how I set this up. Templates are very important, or very helpful actually. If you wanna start a new track, one of the most daunting things is looking at a completely blank project file. It's just, there's something about it. It's just very unmotivating. It doesn't really motivate you to get started, I guess. So making a template can help you get over that barrier, and just so that you already have a bunch of stuff there that you can pretty much immediately start writing stuff. That's why you make a template. So making a template, you should make your template depending on what your needs are. So if you do something in every track that you make, then you want to set that up inside of a template so that you don't have to do it every time you start a new track. So your template will completely depend on what you like and what you do. So I have my template set up in a certain way, but it might be that you end up setting up your template completely different. Do it however you see fit for your workflow. Let's get into the actual template, okay? In my template, you can see I have a bunch of groups here set up. So I've got these black or dark gray tracks at the top and the bottom. I'll talk about those later. I first want to talk about these blue tracks. So I've got one dark blue track, and I've got a couple of other blue tracks that are slightly less dark blue. These ones that I highlight right now, those are all the groups where all my sounds and instruments and all those stuff will go to. So all of my sounds will be going into these groups. This group, I will talk about that later. First group is my drums group. Inside the drums group, I've got a bunch of stuff set up, but nothing is really needed. It just depends on what you want to do. So inside my drums group, I obviously have a kick and a snare channel. So these are just two audio tracks, no processing on them. I like to keep my templates very minimal. A lot of people I see make templates with like, you know, plugins already loaded up on different channels. Sometimes they will have like already have like patches for certain synths loaded up so that they can easily just immediately start jamming when they have an idea. For me, I like to keep things minimal. I just like to have the track set up so that I don't have to add tracks all the time. I don't have to set up my entire template when I start a new track. I can just start putting stuff on these tracks and get started pretty much right away. So I have one audio track for my kick and one audio track for my snare. Then I have another audio track which is called Offbeat Hat. I don't know why it's called that. I probably just would call that hats. On there I would have like, you know, just some hi-hat samples. This is just an audio track as well. So then I have two MIDI tracks. These are called AD hats and AD rides. AD, in my case, stands for Addictive Drums. It's a plugin I use a lot. I don't use it every track, but I use it in a lot of tracks. So what I did is I basically have two MIDI tracks set up so that when I want to use Addictive Drums, the only thing I will have to do is load Addictive Drums on these tracks and I will be able to go. I could actually already load up Addictive Drums in my template and include that with the template itself and load up like a patch with good sounding hats and a patch with good sounding rides or cymbals. That would also be possible, but I like to keep this without the Addictive Drums on it, and I will add it onto it if I need it, because I don't use Addictive Drums in every track that I make. That's it for the tracks inside of the drums group. All of these tracks have no processing applied to it yet. Then I've got this final track, which is my sidechain trigger track, and here I have a hi-hat sample. So this is just a short hi-hat sample made even shorter, and I added like a fade out so that it has like a fade out. It's just like a click, pretty much. I don't know, it's just like a really short hi-hat clicky kind of thing. And I will use this to feed into my sidechain compressors that might be on other groups. So that's it for the drums, or at least for what is in the drums group. On the drums group itself, I have an instance of Camel Fat. Now Camel Fat this plugin has been discontinued, so you cannot buy it anymore. Technically speaking, if you download it, it's still online, it's still around, you can still find it. Technically speaking, it's not piracy anymore if you get this one, because, I mean, the software is not available anymore, so it's pretty much abandonware at this point. You can swap this out for any plugin that acts like a limiter, pretty much. The reason I have this on here, first of all, it acts as a limiter, so anything going over 0 dB will be cut off by camel fat, but it also gives me the ability to just add some slight distortion to the drums if I want to. You can swap this one out for, let's say, Isotope Trash, and it will roughly do the same thing. So that's it for the drums group. Then I've got a bass group. Inside the bass group I've got one MIDI track called Res. Nothing on the track, is just a MIDI track, so that when I want to start designing a bass, I can load up a synth and get started. On the bass group though, I've got a couple of things. I've got a glue compressor. This glue compressor I have on here in case I want to compress the bass. So sometimes you're making bass lines and there's like a lot of volume differences in your bass line. You can control that either by using a compressor or by using a limiter. I've got both of them loaded up on the bass group. So I've got one glue compressor. The way I set up the glue compressor, by the way, is I bring the attack all the way down, because when something goes over the threshold, you basically want the compressor to start compressing fully right away. You don't want it to basically fade in the compression. You want it to pretty much respond as quickly as possible when anything goes over the threshold. And then I basically dial in the release time to taste. This will change depending on the track. Then you can bring the threshold down to kind of even out the volume differences within the bass line, and then you can use the makeup gain to bring that level back up. I like to turn on soft clipping so that when I bring the makeup gain up and I hit the 0 dB mark, I will see this clip light, this clip indicator. It will start blinking, telling me that I'm now hitting the 0 dB mark and I'm applying soft clipping. I like to do this. This can really help to even out your bass lines. It's not needed, but sometimes I will use it. It's not going to be on by default. It'll only be on when there is a problem within the bass line. Next up, I've got a Fabfilter Pro-L. And this is kind of there for the exact same reason. Sometimes using a compressor will not sound as good as I want. And sometimes a limiter simply works better. So I've got this limiter. It's a preset actually from Fabfilter Pro-L from the mixing category called Bass Limiter 1. And I think I changed something. I'm not sure, but just make sure that the style or the algorithm of the limiter is set to safe. I don't know why, but that safe algorithm just sounds super transparent, especially on bass lines. The main problem with bass lines being, if you limit them, is that usually the sub is what is going to trigger the limiter, and if too much sub is running into the limiter, a lot of times it'll start distorting. And I found that with this safe algorithm, it actually distorts very little, and you can get away with a lot of boosting on the gain without it to start sounding shit. So I like to have that as well on here. If there is some big volume differences within my bass line, that's when I would try out using this limiter or using this compressor to kind of fix that. Then I've got a Sidechain Compressor. This Sidechain Compressor is using the Sidechain trigger as the input. So what I would do in a track, I would pretty much just make a MIDI clip the length of my of the transient of my kick. So let's say my kick drum is about this long. I will make like a clip here and just create like a note in there. And then I can just take this clip and just move it around, place it everywhere where there is like a kick or a snare, and just place that in there, and it will automatically trigger the Sidechain Compressor. So the Sidechain Compressor, yeah, again, pretty self-explanatory. I use the Live 8 Sidechain Compressor. They changed the algorithms with the Live 9 compressor. So the algorithms are different with the newer compressor that they've added since Live 9, and it just doesn't sound as good when doing sidechaining. So there's actually a live pack available on the Ableton website right now, which is called, I think it's called the Live 8 Legacy Pack or something like that, which includes a bunch of different effects from the Live 8 effect library, and this sidechain compressor is also included. Grab that pack if you don't have it yet, because it's just way better for sidechaining. Attack time all the way down, because you want that sidechain compressor to respond immediately when the sidechain trigger track is being fed into it. So you basically want it to respond as quickly as possible to the input, which is the trigger track. The release time, you want to change that to taste, depending on what you're doing with your track and depending on how your track sounds like. You really want to play around with that. Same for like the threshold. The threshold will basically be how much compression will be added. So the release time and the threshold will definitely change depending on your track. That's it for the bass group. Then we have a synths group. In the synths group, I just have a blank MIDI track, no synths, no presets loaded up yet. I just load up whatever I need at whatever point I'm starting a track. I do have a group set up, and on here, first of all, I've got that same sidechain compressor. It's the exact same one. I just copied over this one and pasted it on the synths group, so it will look to the exact same sidechain trigger track as the input, and again, all the settings are the same. I think just the threshold is a little bit higher, but the threshold will change depending on the track anyway, so you don't really have to bother looking at that one. Also, in front of the sidechain compressor, I've got an Isotope Trash. The reason I do this is sometimes, especially when I'm making bass, I like to make my basses pretty loud and pretty distorted, and sometimes I feel like when I'm done making my bass, my synths don't sound loud enough compared to the bass. So I have on my synths group an Isotope Trash to basically be able to apply subtle distortion, also called saturation, to my synths, so that I can make them louder and make them, well, on par with the bass in terms of loudness. So sometimes I will use this, sometimes I will turn it on and just play around with this, see if I can get like a nice sound that makes everything sound nice and fat, and then I will use the dry wet here to basically mix it in, basically somewhere between 0 and 50%. I will not usually go above 50%. I want to keep a lot of the dry signal there so that it doesn't become too distorted, but I still want to use a little bit of the distorted signal to mix that in. This will not be on by default. This distortion is only used when the mix is lacking something in terms of loudness or harmonics. Distortion will help filling out the frequencies, it will help gluing things together. Use it whenever you see fit, I guess. Next group is the atmosphere group. So in my bass group, it's all pretty self-explanatory. All my bass lines will go there. In my synths group, I will usually put stuff like chords or lead synths or plucks or anything like that. In my atmosphere group, I will put all my pads, so all my pads and soundscape kind of things, and I will also put all my risers and all my sound effects, all my sweeps and those kind of things. I feel like because pads are such a ambient kind of sound, a more atmospheric kind of sound, I feel like putting those in the atmosphere group as opposed to the synths group makes more sense, because then I can glue the pads together with the white noise sweeps and all those kind of things. On the atmosphere group, there is nothing except that same sidechain compressor. I like to have like a very subtle amount of sidechain compression on my atmosphere group, so that it just ducks the atmosphere away ever so slightly when a kick or snare hits, just to make the kick and snare feel a little bit more powerful, and give them a little bit more of its own space within the mix. Again, usually I will actually have all of these sidechain compressors turned off when I start a track, and I will only turn them on when I need them, because sometimes you don't need to do sidechain compression to make things work in a mix. Sometimes there is enough space in a mix to make things work without sidechain compression. All of these effects that you are seeing right now, I only use them when I need to use them. So when there is a problem that needs to be fixed. If there's no problem, there's no point in using them. So yeah, that's it for the atmosphere group. Then we have the vocal group. This group is, well, completely empty. There's nothing on here, nothing on the group itself, and there's just one blank audio track in here with nothing going on there as well. So just when I want to add a vocal, I've got an audio track, so I don't have to make one. I can just drag a vocal sample in and get started. That's it for all the groups. So these groups are then all routed to this final track, which is the pre-master track. You could do it different these days. You could, for instance, now take all of your groups and just group them again, and then call this group pre-master. Will be the exact same thing. I like the pre-master track to be below my other tracks, so that's why I still use like an audio track, and I basically just went into all of these groups, selected them all, and went into here and set pre-master as the output. So that means that all of these groups will be sending to the pre-master track, as you can see right here, and right here, right here, and right here. So all of those groups sent to the pre-master track. Now, why the pre-master track? Well, let's say you are done with your mix. The mix sounds nice, the balance of the mix is good, but you feel when you compare your mix to another track, it lacks a little bit of harmonics. It doesn't sound as full as the other track that you're referencing to. At that point, you could go into the individual tracks and start applying subtle distortion like saturation to certain individual elements to make them sound louder, but this will affect the balance of your mix. Instead, what you could also do is apply subtle distortion or subtle saturation or compression or anything that will help gel things together or create more harmonics. You can apply that also on the entire mix. The benefit of that is that you will not be affecting the balance of the mix that much. You will in fact be enhancing the mix you already have. So if your mix sounds balanced and you apply subtle distortion to it, good chance it will still sound balanced but just a little bit fuller. So that's why I have this pre-master track. Everything runs through it, and on here I have basically just two effects. I've got a compressor, the API 2500. I really like this one for like just a final bit of glue compressing on the entire mix. The preset I loaded up is called the Levine Modern Mastering Glue. I just play around with the threshold to get like, I don't know, maybe 2 decibels of gain reduction, something like that. Very subtle, it's just gonna glue things together. It's not an aggressive compressor by any means. And then in front of it, I've got an Isotope Trash. And this Isotope Trash will only be used if I think the mix needs some more harmonics. If I think it needs to be filled out more in the frequency spectrum, I might use this Isotope Trash to introduce a few additional harmonics that weren't really there before. How I would use this, I have this preset loaded up called Push-Pull. Push-Pull, it's kind of like a saturation preset, but what this actually is, this is actually a preset more close to what digital clipping would be. Soft clipping would round off these curves here. So if I do this, you can see that these curves now become a little bit rounded. That would kind of be like soft clipping. And with these hard edges, that would kind of be like digital clipping. So what this is going to do, it's basically going to introduce additional harmonics. But if I use this, I always use it very subtly. So you have your dry wet here, right? What I always do is, just like with the other trash that I had in this template, is I would always have the mix set somewhere between 0 to 50%. So I will just mix a little bit of the distorted signal in with the dry signal just to give it a little bit more harmonics. Will not be that much, it will not affect the mix too much, it'll just, you know, add some more harmonics, add some more grit. And the plus side of it is that it will also help gel things together, because if you basically, any effect that you apply to the entire mix as a whole will help to make that mix sound more cohesive. It just glues things together because you apply the same effect to everything at once. And that goes for any effect. Obviously some effects are better. You're not going to apply a reverb to your full mix and expect it to gel things together nicely. It will probably not sound good. But compression, limiting, distortion, all of those kind of things, and there's way more effects like EQ and stuff like that, will all help to gel things together and make it sound more cohesive. So these two effects are only used when I think I need them. They're definitely not on by default. Usually they're turned off for the most part of the track. I just might turn them on at the end when I feel like the mix is done. I just feel it could be a little bit louder. I might turn this on and add like a little bit of distortion. So that's it for all of the groups. Now let's talk about these two other groups, or these two other tracks, I should say. So I've got this reference track. This track is basically just a track where I can put a reference track on, so a different track that I know is produced well, that I really like, and that I think sounds really good, and that I want my music to sound like. I can use that track then to compare my own track to. Very important though, create that reference track, so this is just an audio track. You want to set the output of that track to bypass the master track. So by default, it will send the signal to the master track. You don't want that, because what is going to happen is your master track, because the track that you'll pick as a reference track is going to be a track by a famous artist, right? So it's going to be mastered. That track will now be running through the master track here, and whatever you have going on your master track will be applied to your reference track. That's not going to be helpful, because you're not going to be able to compare things correctly. So what you want to do on that reference track, you want to set the output to external out, and then select your speaker output pretty much. So the output that goes to your speakers, which in my case is a 1 and 2. And now when I put a track on here and play it, if I solo that track and I play that, that track will not be running through the master chain. It will actually go straight to my speakers. So then I can just play my own track, which will run through the master track with the mastering applied, and then when I want to compare it to the reference track, all I have to do while my track is playing is solo this track, and I will immediately hear the reference track without any additional processing to it, so I can A/B my track to the reference track. Then we have this other track called Resampling. This track I use because I'm a visual kind of guy. I like to see things. When I'm making a bass line, for instance, I can record my bass line on this resampling track just to see the waveform. I could see, for instance, in that waveform, sometimes you might see a huge volume spike. Hey, that might be something we want to fix. So by visually being able to see what is going on with the waveform of your track, I sometimes can see like problems in the mix. I might see more easily what the balance is in between the volume of the intro compared to the drop. That is very easy to see from a waveform. So I have this resampling track, which is again just an audio track, and I've set the input to resampling. So whenever I want to record whatever I'm playing back at that particular time, I just have to record enable this track, go somewhere and just press record, and it will start recording, and it will record whatever is playing back. So you'll be able to see the waveform of whatever you recorded right here, and that will be very helpful. Also on this one, make sure that the output is again set to external out, because whatever you record, it will be recording whatever comes out of the master track. So if there's mastering applied to your track on the master track, and you then don't send it directly to the output from this track, if you play it, if you listen to this track, then it will be running through the master track again, and you don't want that. So make sure that external out and directly to your speakers is also selected on that track. So that's for all these tracks, pretty much. I've got one return track set up right here at the bottom. Just one return track. I've got nothing on here, but usually I will use this for like a reverb that I use to apply reverb to sounds in my track. Again, very important, this one, the output is set to the pre-master, because I want the reverb from the return track to be mixed in with the rest of the track in this pre-master track, so that when I apply some distortion or compression to the full mix, it will include the reverb from the return track, because by default this will be going to your master track, so it will bypass this track right here. That's not what I want. I want this to go into the pre-master together with all the other tracks, together with all the groups, so that I can process the entire mix as a whole. That from the pre-master group is then going into the master track. And onto the master track, I've got a bunch of things that we can talk about, but these are, these change all the time. These change depending on what plugins I like, what kind of style of music I make. This could all change, but yeah, let's just quickly run through it. First up, I will always have an EQ on my master track. Right now, it's the LKJB Lufticus EQ, which is kind of like a mastering EQ. This could be any EQ. This could be Fabfilter Pro-Q. It could be the default Ableton Live EQ. It could be anything. Sometimes when you have your mix done, it sounds balanced, it sounds right, but there's just a little, you just want to EQ it slightly. You might want to add like a little bit of high frequencies, or want to take out a little bit of the mid frequencies. I always have an EQ on there so that I can just give it a little EQing and see if that makes it better. On the master track, I will not be doing huge EQ cuts or boosts or anything like that. On this particular EQ, you would not see me go below 2 or 3. I will not do stuff like 10 dB boosts or anything like that, or 10 dB cuts. I will do very little cuts and boosts on the master track, because if you have to do a lot of EQing on your master track, that is an indication that there's a problem with your mix, and you should probably go into the separate tracks and fix it there. There's no reason to having to apply a lot of EQing to your full track as a whole. If there is, fix it in the mix and not on the master track. So that's just there. I like to use that to just balance the frequencies a little bit. Sometimes it's needed and sometimes it can make your track better. So next up would be my limiters. So that's actually the only thing I would do in terms of processing before I run into the limiter. My master track is very, very minimal. I don't do a lot on it. It's usually EQ and limiting. That's pretty much it. So I have 3 limiters set up. You might be thinking, why 3? Well, I've got Fabfilter Pro-L. This is the first limiter. This one is the one I would use most of the time. So this is like my default limiting setup. It's basically just a preset called Practically Clipping. I use that preset most of the time. However, sometimes this preset doesn't really sound as good as I want. I can tweak the preset, of course, to my needs, but I find it easier to have a couple of different limiters, or the same limiter set up in a different way on my master track, so that I can just quickly switch through these limiters and see which one sounds best. So I've got 2 Fabfilter Pro-Ls. The second one is just set up different from the first one. That's the only difference, pretty much. And then I have another limiter, which is another favorite of mine, which is the Aom Invisible Limiter, the G2 version. I like this one a lot. It's very transparent. I can usually get more loudness out of this one than I can get out of Fabfilter Pro-L. But, it's also a more resource intensive limiter, so sometimes it adds too much latency for me being able to work on a track properly. So, but I do like this limiter. So I have a bunch of different limiters set up so that I can switch between them and see, if a different limiter setup might sound better on this particular track. In the end, I will usually only use one of them on the final track, and the other ones will just be turned off. Sometimes though, I might use 2 limiters to get my track to sound as loud as I want. Sometimes one limiter, for instance this one, usually I find when I use 8 decibels here, with the way how my groups are set up, 8 decibels is usually enough for me to get about 3 to 4 decibels of gain reduction on the limiter here. If I boost it more, then a lot of times it'll start to distort and starts to sound not any better, it'll actually start to sound worse. If that's the case, and I still want to get more loudness out of my track, I might use a second limiter, like for instance this invisible limiter, and boost it with, let's say, another 2 or 3 decibels. And most of the time, using 2 limiters that work together to make things louder will sound cleaner than having one limiter that does all the work by itself. So sometimes I just split it. I just do one limiter first that does things a little bit less harsh than you would normally do, and then take a second limiter to do like the final extra step of gain reduction, just to make it, as loud as your reference track, or as loud as other tracks on the radio or other tracks that are being released, whatever. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So anything after these limiters is just there for like utility purposes, for just checking things, metering, measuring, I guess. First one up is a utility. This utility, only thing that I did is I turned on the mono switch. So why do I have this? I want to make sure that my track sounds good in both stereo and in mono. These days, still in clubs and venues, a lot of clubs and venues use a mono system. So if you want your track to sound good in a club, you gotta make sure that it sounds good in mono. If there's a lot of phase cancellation, something might sound good in stereo, but when you sum it to mono, it might sound really thin because frequencies are canceling each other out. If you have this utility on mono with the mono switch turned on your master and you turn it on, you will easily be able to hear if your track sounds good in mono, and when you then turn it back off, you can hear how much different it sounds from your track in stereo. The main thing is you don't want to lose too much of your track when summing it to mono, but you also don't want your track to sound super centered as if it is completely mono. So usually the low end will be more mono than the higher frequencies, but you can play around with that. I feel like having this utility on here definitely helps to spot any issues with the phase or with phase cancellation, because when it's turned on and you're listening to your track in mono, if there is any phase cancellation happening, you will immediately hear it, because it will be just a phasey, thin sound as opposed to the wide and full stereo sound when this utility is turned off. You will immediately hear it. So definitely advice that I can give you is have something on your master so that you can listen to your track in mono. Next up is just spectrum analyzers. So I want to be able to see the frequencies that are in my track. So I've got the default Ableton Live one. I have this on my master because it's just a very simple one. I can just, while my track is playing, all I have to do is go to the master track and I will immediately see what is happening. It's not the most precise spectrum analyzer, so for that reason I also have a Spen by Voxengo. This one is a little bit more advanced, gives you some more features like loading in frequency curves of other tracks, stuff like that. Definitely helps to compare like the frequency curve of your track to, let's say, a track that you really like, and it gives me a bit more of a bigger and more detailed view of this one. So they both do the same thing pretty much. I prefer this one, but I still have this one on here so that I don't have to open up Spen every time that I want to see the frequencies. Then I have one more plugin for metering, just checking things and checking levels and all those kind of things. Isotope Inside. I'm not going to explain this entire plugin, but it's very simple. You've got stuff here for measuring the loudness. Again, here it is also for measuring the loudness. This one right here is for measuring the stereo of your track and the stereo width, which is very helpful. This and this one right here are both to measure and analyze the frequency content of your track. This is just a regular spectrum analyzer, and this is a spectrogram, which works slightly different, but they both roughly do the same thing. And that's it. That's it for the entire template. There's one last thing on my master track, which is not really that important, which is not really needed, but does help me a lot. Sonarworks Reference 4. This is used by me to basically calibrate my headphones, calibrate my speakers so that they have a flatter frequency curve, making it easier for me to hear what I'm doing. If you use Sonarworks, always be sure that when you're done making a track and you're gonna export your track, to turn this plugin off, because you don't want the calibration to be included in the track, because the calibration is specific to your setup, specific to your speakers, specific to your room, and specific to your headphones. So you don't want that to be applied to the track when you're bouncing it to audio for like the final version that you're gonna release somewhere, gonna upload to SoundCloud or YouTube or whatever. And that's it. That's it for the entire template. So I hope you guys learned something from this. Now, I never thought I would make a tutorial about a template, about the template that I use, because I think this is all pretty self-explanatory. If I use a particular piece of software, then good chance is that I'm gonna be sitting there, you know, arranging the software in such a way that it fits my workflow. I do that with a lot of pieces of software that I use, but I guess for somebody just starting out, this might help. So if you learned something today, and if you had a little bit of help from this video, then please subscribe to this channel. I do a lot more music production content and tutorials, and if you want to stay up to date, you can subscribe to this channel and click the bell notification icon, and with that you will be notified whenever I post a tutorial or when I do a live stream. Talking about live streams, I do live streams every Friday, 8 p.m. Central European time, so if you have some time upcoming Friday, feel free to tune in. On the end of the live stream, I will always do a feedback session where you can send in your own music and you can ask me to get some tips on your music. So if you want to do that, then feel free to join in upcoming Friday. Before the feedback session, I will always be working on some tracks or doing some sound design or doing production or just taking, like, you know, requests of people in the chat, whatever. But at the end of the stream, I will always do a feedback session. I also have a Discord server, so if you want to be part of a music production community on Discord, I have a server with hundreds of people in there right now. A lot of people who make drum and bass, and we also have a lot of people of other genres as well. Every genre is allowed. If you want to become a better producer, talk to like-minded people, share your music, or get tips on your music, then the Discord server is the place to be. So if you want to check it out, invite link is below this video in the description. Would like to see you guys there. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you back soon. Peace.